Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, it's funny. I've been at my church for about 3 years now. We were just talking about how even though I've been there for 3 years, it feels like longer and shorter at the same time because 2 of those years have been during the pandemic. And a lot of times, like, our staff will be talking, and they're like, "Wait, you don't know about this? Like, you've been here for so long." I'm like, "No, I've only been through like 1 actual year at this church." But I do work with middle school and high school. I am very similar to Jeremy. It's funny too, like a lot of the little connections here at MBC, like Jeremy did our wedding, so he's a close friend of mine. But I got to be here just one of my friends started working here, and so that's how I kind of got introduced to the church. I didn't start coming because of Deanna. It was later on that we started dating, before we first met, like a year or so after we first met, so it took a while. But yeah, we're married now, and yeah, it's been kind of crazy. It's been a fun journey, but it's fun to be here. It's great to be here with all of you. I enjoy doing a lot of different things. I play the piano, I play guitar, I enjoy leading worship occasionally. On my free time, I will boulder or rock climb a lot. I love rock climbing. I try to go as often as possible. Lately, I've been really lazy, and it's really just hard to get up, but I enjoy playing a lot of video games, board games. There's a few things I like watching on TV. And I also enjoy collecting things, specifically Pokemon cards and Magic cards. Thank you. Now, if you don't collect trading cards, you might not know exactly what the heck I'm talking about. So let me introduce you to something that I enjoy doing, something that I collect a lot. I also started recently selling my cards. But similar to sports cards, okay, the cards that I collect, they are pieces of cardboard that have pictures and text on them. Now, the cardboard pieces that I buy can also be used to play games with. And believe it or not, these cardboard pieces are worth a lot of money, which means I spend a lot of money on cardboard. And occasionally, this business, right, the businesses that sell these cardboard, they will sell only a handful at a time, or just a little bit, or a special one, right, to create this sense of urgency because of their scarcity. And ultimately, what ends up happening is there becomes a mad rush to people to buy out whatever they can find, right? Where they go to the store, they find the Pokemon cards in the section, and they buy whatever they can. There's nothing left. Now, Target is one of my go-to happy places. I enjoy going to Target. There's something about like the lights, the way that it's set up, the familiarity, is that however you say that word. But I enjoy walking through Target even if I don't buy anything, okay? And especially in the summer, there's AC. I might be giving away too much information about myself and a little bit too much detail, but my feet get really sweaty and really hot, and so sometimes I'll like kick off my sandals and I'll walk around barefoot because the floor is really cool. I know it's really dirty. But that's something that I do in the summer to cool off my feet. But anytime I go into a Target, right, I go straight to the section with all the cards. And that's kind of near the front, near the bathroom. I needed to make clear because I want to make sure that you all know my shoes are on when I'm in this section. But near the bathroom in front of Target, there's the section where all the cards are at. And when I'm in that section, right, I'm looking at the cards, and I'm like, oh, I want to buy these. I typically try not to. But for a while, the companies were not creating enough of these cardboard pieces to meet the demand of everyone who wanted to buy them, right? And often you'd see shelves usually filled with cards, with Pokemon cards, with Magic cards, or with Yu-Gi-Oh cards, or different sports cards. At my youth group, I had parents coming up to me saying they haven't seen any Pokemon cards at their local Target or Walmart in so long. Like, where do I buy these? My kids really want to buy Pokemon cards, but I can't find them anywhere. Now, my wife is extremely patient and understanding, but sometimes I get sucked into wanting these new special, right? And usually these special sets are only out for a limited time, and they're with a special design or a special artist, and it makes this feeling like these cards are going to be scarce. There's not very many of them. And I'm a sucker for this tactic. I see these cards that are out for a limited time, sometimes only a week, and I tell my wife I have to get these. Like, they're only out for a limited time. I have to have these. They're scarce. Now, I think back when the pandemic first started, do you remember when toilet paper was like that? Where suddenly it became a scarce commodity, right? Where you'd walk into a Target or a Walmart or practically anywhere and just shelves of empty upon empty shelves with no toilet paper. And it was actually kind of scary walking into that, right? There was no toilet paper. And there's something about scarcity that draws our attention to it. Sometimes it's good. It deserves our attention so that we can react. But sometimes, though, we spend too much time dwelling on what we don't have rather than what we do have. Now, I find that many of us tend to look at what we lack in scarcity before recognizing what we have through the lens of abundance. Now, I can look at all the cards that I don't have, the ones that I'm missing, the ones that are limited edition, or think about how few toilet paper rolls I have left in our household. But we can look at the same situation and make a completely different choice based on our perspective. I can look at everything that I'm lacking, that I don't have, or I can start to see the things that are already. Now, this might not always be at Target with expensive cardboard or toilet paper, but maybe even as we look within ourselves and consider things like our own giftings, our own capabilities, that we tend to look at what we lack. Maybe it's our inability to do a certain thing, think a certain way, speak as eloquently, and we often think to ourselves that we're not good enough, not qualified enough. Maybe it's during a high-pressure moment like an interview process, or maybe in the mundane moments of our daily lives. Feeling like you don't have what it takes to do well in school. Wondering the same about parenting, or as a partner, an employee, a friend. See, sometimes these moments happen randomly when we just start looking at ourselves and see everything that we don't have or what we don't do. We see this a lot in Scripture, actually, and some pretty key people go through these moments of focusing too much on what they lack and forget about what they have. Moses, for instance, is called by God to lead the people out of Egypt, out of slavery in Exodus chapter 3. We recognize that God sees the oppression. Okay, so God comes down and sees the oppression of his people in Egypt, and God hears the cries of his people who are being enslaved, and they're being abused. And at this point in the story, God is now going to act and do something to free the people. And to do this, if you remember, God calls Moses to lead the people out of Egypt into freedom. Now, you would think that being called by God, especially in this point in the story through a burning bush, that would be enough for Moses to say, yes, whatever you want, right? But what we see is that Moses and God actually go back and forth for a long time. They kind of clash. Moses starts with this point and pointing out that he is a nobody. He's a nobody. He has no authority. How can God expect a shepherd to waltz up to Pharaoh just to ask God to let God's people go? Moses points out his lack of confidence, and God assures Moses that God's going to be with Moses as he approaches Pharaoh. And so he's going to be fine. You're going to be fine, Moses. Then Moses turns and says, but what about the Israelites? What if the Israelites, your people, don't listen to me, don't believe what it is that I have to say? And God responds here too. And we start to see a pattern in Moses' conversation with God in Exodus that leads us to believe that maybe Moses just didn't want to go in the first place. And rebuttal after rebuttal, God gives Moses, and Moses seems to have a new excuse for Moses' excuse, right? Moses doesn't have the authority to approach Pharaoh. And maybe the Israelites aren't even going to listen to Moses. Moses can't talk good. And God responds, well, who do you think it is that lets people talk, and decides whether people can talk or not? And at the end of this conversation, at the end of it all, Moses still pleads with God to send someone else. See, Moses focuses in on all of what he can't do. See, his perspective looks inwardly on what is scarce, rather than what God has given him in abundance. And we see the same pattern over and over and over again in the Old Testament. We see the same pattern in Judges chapter 6, where the Israelites were suffering again under oppression against the Midianites, and God hears the cries of the Israelites and acts upon the oppression. And so an angel calls to Gideon to go and strike down all the Midianites. And Gideon's response, very similar to Moses, is that he is the least in his family and that his clan was the weakest. We see this in Jeremiah chapter 1, where when Jeremiah is called to be a prophet to the nations, and his response is that he doesn't know how to speak and that he's too young. So we see moments like this when someone is called by God and their initial response is, I'm not good enough. I could never lead those people into freedom. I don't know how to speak eloquently enough. You should send someone else. I'm too young. Go ask my older brother. I'm too weak. I'm not strong enough. I'm not qualified. I don't have the kind of experience. I don't have the time, the money, the resources to do what it is that you are asking of me, God. I don't have enough. These stories sound all too familiar to our own. How many times have we made an excuse to not answer the calling that God has set out for us? Maybe let's change this idea a little bit. How many times have we made an excuse like, I don't have that kind of time or energy or resources to serve those around me? How many times have we made an excuse like, I don't know the person. They intimidate me. They won't listen to what it is that I have to say to them. How many times have we made a similar excuse not to love someone the way that Christ is calling us to love them? And I think more often than not, a lot of people believe in God, but doubt they could ever be used by God. We believe in God, but doubt we have enough to be used by God. See, Moses, Gideon, and Jeremiah did not have a problem with believing in God, but had a problem in believing that they had enough to be used by God. And I think you and I are the same. I can't tell you how many times I've had an opportunity to love someone else. Right? Maybe through just asking how their day was going and actually listening in to their story, or have made an excuse to share about my faith because they've they've probably heard about Jesus before. And besides, I can't explain my faith as well as maybe someone else could. They've not only heard it, I can't explain it well, but maybe we let our title get in the way. That maybe, I'm not a pastor, so well, that's the pastor's job. Or I don't have that kind of education to engage in that kind of conversation. Well, I'll let someone else do it. If I'm honest, the ones that come up a lot for me is I didn't get enough sleep last night. I'm really tired. I'm really sleepy. I don't have enough energy, or I have too much to do that there isn't enough time. And yet God calls us into these spaces over and over and over again. And I wonder if we are just like Moses, just like Gideon, just like Jeremiah, where we believe in God, but we doubt that we are enough to be used by God. See, we tend to look at what we lack rather than what we have, in our weakness instead of our strengths, with scarcity rather than abundance. And this theme actually carries over into the New Testament as well. Many of us have read or maybe have heard the story, the feeding of the 4,000. It's very similar to the story about the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew. Just a side note, feeding of the 5,000 isn't in all four of the Gospels. The feeding of the 4,000 is in Matthew and Mark. It's very easy to get mixed up. I got mixed up a lot as I was reading through this because they're very similar stories. But it starts in Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 29. It says this: Jesus returned to the Sea of Galilee and climbed a hill and sat down. A vast crowd brought to him people who were lame, blind, crippled, those who couldn't speak, and many others. They laid them before Jesus, and he healed them all. Okay, when I read this, I have a lot of questions going through my head about this part of the story, because Jesus is climbing up a hill, okay? But there's a crowd of people who are bringing others to go see Jesus, to go be healed by Jesus, who may not have been able to climb or to walk, and yet Jesus is climbing up a hill. And why is Jesus climbing this hill? Is he trying to get away from the crowd? He's trying to not heal them and just run away and be by himself? Now, there's actually something really interesting going on here, and it's not going to completely answer my questions. I get a lot of questions as I read text. You'll find that out. It's not going to completely answer this question, but there's something going on that we often miss. The mountaintop was the place where God and humanity would most often meet. Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. The prophet Elijah spoke to God in his silent whisper on Mount Horeb. Eventually, Jesus was crucified on Calvary or Golgotha, a hill. See, the mountain was a place where heaven and earth met. It's the place where we're about to read on, people were healed. Verse 31 says this: the crowd was amazed. Those who hadn't been able to speak were talking. The crippled were made well. The lame were walking, and the blind could see again, and they praised the God of Israel. Then Jesus called the disciples and told them, I feel sorry for these people. Or in some translations, I have compassion for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they will faint along the way. Verse 33 says this: the disciples replied, where would we get enough food here in the wilderness for such a huge crowd? This response from the disciples is interesting because it brings us into their perspective of how they see the world, of how they see their current situation. If you remember, we are at the second point where Jesus is about to feed a lot of people. Okay, the first time being the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew chapter 14. The second time where we just read in Matthew chapter 15, which is the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, so feeding of the 5,000 and then feeding of the 4,000 where we're at now. Now you would think that their response would be to immediately offer what it is that they had, right? To give Jesus an opportunity to reenact and to do what he did not too long ago. But the disciples, their perspective is to focus in on what they lack, the lack of food, the scarcity, rather than the abundance. Right, we read on, Jesus asks a question, how much bread do you have? Now this question, how much bread do you have, gives us insight into how Jesus sees with perspective. So put a pin in this question, and we're going to read on. Jesus asked, how much bread do you have? They replied, 7 loaves and a few small fish. Again, another question that pops up in my head as I am reading this that we won't really get into, and honestly, it probably doesn't matter. But how long were the disciples going to be holding on or going to go without eating until they decide to whip out the 7 loaves and the few small fish to eat as a snack, right? I go on hikes. I'm not a hiker, but I will go on hikes occasionally. And within the first hour, I'm already snacking on my trail mix. I'm already bringing out the jerky or whatever it is that we brought with us, right? Drinking all my water. Within that first hour, they've been at this journey for a while, and only till now do they bring out their snacks. Now, we read on, Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to the disciples who distributed the food to the crowd. They all ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were 4,000 men who were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. Then Jesus sent the people home, and he got into a boat and crossed over to the region of Magadan. Now, in this passage, we learn a lot about who Jesus is and how he sees. We recognize that Jesus sees those who are hungry, and he has compassion for them. The kind of compassion that moves him into action. And I think it's a similar kind of compassion that is happening when God hears the cries of his people in the Old Testament, right? When God hears the cries of the Israelites in captivity, being abused, enslaved. And what we see is that compassion moves us into action. Compassion moves us into action. But compassion also helps us to see with perspective. Compassion is one of the things that helps us to see what we have rather than what we don't. When we see Jesus' perspective, we see in abundance rather than in scarcity. When we read the stories in the Old Testament, we see God's compassion for the people, right? Seeing with perspective for what is available, who's available to be used, then moving to free the people from their oppression. But the opposite is also true. A lack of compassion doesn't cause movement. A lack of compassion doesn't cause movement. We see this lack of compassion in many of the starting journeys of the prophets. They didn't move. They made excuses. They doubted their ability. They thought they weren't good enough. They weren't old enough. They weren't strong enough. They weren't wise enough. Some went the opposite direction, only to be swallowed by a fish later, to be turned around. But here we see Jesus has compassion. And he sees with perspective what the disciples have and asks the question, how much bread do you have? How much bread do you have? This question that Jesus asked the disciples goes against so much of what we are bombarded with in our daily lives today. because our lives are typically lived in comparison, or a yearning, or recognizing that we don't have what it takes. Instead of recognizing how much we already have, we look at things differently and see how much we don't have. It's the kind of comments we often will think to ourselves that we are not enough. We don't have that kind of experience, that kind of motivation. It's the kind of comments that Moses and Gideon and Jeremiah at one point bought into, that they were not going to have the right words to say, that they were not strong enough, that they were too young. It's the same kind of comments that we deal with today, that tell us we don't have the kind of experience, we don't have the kind of resources, we don't have the kind of time. But what we see here is that Jesus is not asking the question, how much bread do they need? But how much bread do you have? Because Jesus sees with perspective. Jesus sees with perspective, specifically the kind of perspective of what they have. As opposed to what they lack, he asks them, how much do you have, not how much do you need? And from the few loaves and the few fish that they had, Jesus fed thousands with plenty left. What would it look like if we saw with Jesus' perspective? How might our lives be fundamentally changed if we saw with Jesus' perspective? What would it look like if we had the eyes to see what we have instead of what we lack? If we started simply with what we have rather than what we don't? If we were able to see with Jesus' perspective, would it force us not to just believe in him, but to also believe that we could be used by him? Have we become so focused on what we lack that we've forgotten or not even noticed what we have in the first place? Maybe not just what we have, but who we have. See, Jesus sees with perspective. A few weeks ago, a good friend of mine, a core leader within our youth group, within our student ministries at our church, her name is Mary Feibush, passed away. She's been battling cancer for a very long time. And I'm assuming that none of you have met her before, but I want to tell you something about her that she would make very clear to you if you've met her. Mary loved our students. She loved our student ministry. She had compassion for our students. She served with our student ministry for longer than 15 years. And one of the things that I would always hear her tell each of our students from day one when I met her was that any of the students, anyone could call her at any time, that you could call at any time. She would always tell the students that if they were in need, if something happened and they didn't know who to turn to, that they could call her. She would also tell them that it didn't matter what time it was, whether it was during dinner time, 9 p.m., 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., that Mary would pick up for these students. I think my friend Mary saw with the same perspective that Jesus saw with. Because so many of us would only pick up between the hours of 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. Or if we got a call from someone at, 4 a.m., would maybe just look at it and think to ourselves that it was a scam from the East Coast or another country. Or maybe you think to yourselves, oh, I have work the next day or the next morning. I need to get my sleep, so I'll call back later on when I'm free. Because if I pick up now, I won't even be able to speak eloquently enough. Formulate the thoughts in my head. I'm not going to get enough sleep. I'm going to be tired, and the conversation is not going to go well. See, one of the things that I appreciated about Mary was that she had so much compassion for the people around her, that it helped her to see with perspective. Compassion moved her to act and say, what do I have? Rather than, what do I lack? It was what motivated her to say that you could call her at 3 a.m. Compassion is one of the things that drives us from just seeing what we lack through the lenses of scarcity to seeing with perspective, to what we have in abundance, like Jesus did. Compassion is what allows us to recognize what can be used with what we have instead of dwelling about what we don't. Compassion is what helps us to release and give freely of what we have to those in need. Compassion is one of the things that shifts our perspective to Jesus' perspective. From the doubts that we often hold on to, that we are not good enough, that we do not have the kind of experience, that we don't have the finances, the time, the capacity, we don't have the kinds of resources. See, compassion changes this perspective and allows us to see what it is that we have that can be used to bless those around us. When we have compassion that drives us to see with the perspective of Jesus, all of the sudden, the 7 loaves and the few small fish that we had go a lot further than what we may have initially thought. All of a sudden, our perspective changes from those 2 hours of sleep that we just had are more than enough to care for those in need. All of a sudden, the things we felt we once had in scarcity are enough for God to use abundantly. Would you pray with me? God, so often we have the faith. We believe in you, but doubt that we could be used by you. God, would you help us to recognize that we are constantly being invited by you to be used for the kingdom? God, would you give us your eyes to see from your perspective? God, help us to see what it is that we have in abundance rather than what we don't in scarcity. God, we thank you for your sacrifice, the ways in which you give to us in abundance. God, would you challenge us to give in the same way to others abundantly?